Assalamu alaikum. Good day to everyone from wherever you are in the world watching us for Literary Conversations Across Borders. It is an absolute pleasure and delight to be with you again. This is our 7th in a row. Last week we were looking at the mission to Mars. This week we're going back in time and looking at something that I think is a great topic and something that we're always trying to find an answer to. Legend, myth, and history. Is it a mystery, the history? Where can we draw the line? Humankind thrive on stories which from the beginning of time have helped us interpret the world around us. Myths may seem fantastical, but have generally evolved to explain the past, often with a basis rooted in fact. Actual happenings are embellished and added to, passed on from person to person, down the generations, to help them make sense of the present. The history of the UAE can be traced back to the Neolithic age. Where does fact meet fiction? And what is the responsibility of historians in ensuring that the true interpretation of events is portrayed? Well, we have an absolute treat in store for you. We've got two eminent speakers and writers who will be, I'm sure, showing us some way and some light on how there is an intertwining between legend, myth, and history. So a great welcome to Bettany Hughes, historian, writer, and documentary maker. Hello, Bettany, welcome.
Hello, lovely to see you. Lovely to see everybody who's here.
Yes, and thank you so much. And if we see your cat in the background, can we wave?
You can. She's asleep at the moment.
Okay,
so
okay.
We need to be very animated for the hour to wake her up.
Okay, okay. And then, of course, joined with Bettany, we've got Peter Hellier, who is an advisor to the UAE's National Media Council and author and editor of nearly 20 books on the UAE's archaeology, history, and environment. So I can't wait to hear what you're going to discuss and where you're going to agree to disagree and where you're going to agree on how we should tell history. So over to you two, and I will join you back at the end, but I'll be listening along with the audience from all around the world. Thank you so much for being part of this, Bettany and Peter.
Thank you, Isabel. Lovely to see you. I mean, I think it's such a wonderful honour to be able to talk about this today, because ever more so, doesn't it feel as though history is almost the most compelling and important question that we have in front of us? That even though times are changing and we're all living through extraordinary change in the first half of 2020, we need to understand the context of our cultural and social and political landscapes. We need to understand the depths of the roots of the problems that we're dealing with. And also, I don't know if you agree, Peter, it's become ever more urgent, the question of who owns whose history, who writes whose history, who in effect is wielding the pen. So it's actually a strangely exciting time for us historians and archaeologists. I think we've always known, because we love history, that history matters. The rather brilliant thing is that neuroscientists are now our allies in this, and they tell us that we are physiologically creatures of memory, that we carry memory right across our brain. To kind of simplify, an apology to any neuroscientists out there, that in a way, in order to have any future ideas, we need to access a memory of some kind. So if we deny our histories, it's not just that we're diminishing our pasts, it's that we're cauterizing and etiolating our presence and our possibilities as a species, as humans, because we are creatures of memory. So it's this rather wonderful thing that we understand the power of memory and history and myth. And I think because we're now living in a time when we talk a lot about fake news and the problem of fake ideas being circulated, it's becoming ever more urgent to talk about what is and what isn't fake olds, in a sense, you know, the fake pasts that are either delivered and shared because they are imagination or because they are changing actually the story of history as it was. I'm a historian primarily of the ancient world, and I think it's very interesting that the word myth doesn't actually mean something that's made up. It means something, a kind of point of information that somehow relates to the world that we're living in now. So myths were always thought to be super important in ancient civilizations. And I was just going to ask you, Peter, but when you're doing your work as an archaeologist and as a historian, have you ever had any particular moments in the UAE itself when something that might be considered folklore or a story has actually led you to hard history in the ground and to new archaeological discoveries?
Yes, I mean, there is a nice one. But first, let me pick you up on something you said before. I mean, history, you and I know, is important. Now, increasingly, in the debates around Black Lives Matter and everything else, there is an awareness of the need to look at history more. And history is not a simple thing. You find new discoveries allow us to interpret history differently. When histories are written, aspects get overlooked that perhaps we should now be looking at again. So it's history is the past, but it is an evolving thing as well, which reminds me of the saying of Sheikh Zayed, who founded the UAE, that a people that does not know its past cannot cope with the present or understand the future. And I think that that's very relevant today. But have I found something or heard something in my own work? Yes, a lovely story from 20 odd years ago now of an oil engineer working in an oil terminal in the west of Abu Dhabi. And I had a couple of archaeologists down there looking at some 17th century sulfur mines, as it happens. And this local guy, local Emirati Bedouin, said, "My father and I know of dinosaur prints in the desert." So we said, dinosaurs, that is, 200 million years ago. There is no geology of that age on the surface anywhere in the Emirates, And my archaeologist said, you must be joking, or you must be mistaken. But he really insisted and said, no, they're dinosaur footprints. You've got to come and have a look at them. So I got a couple of geology friends of mine to go and have a look. And yes, the rocks were not that age. They were only 6 to 8 million years ago. But there were these enormous great footprints. And it turned out that they were fossil footprints of now extinct elephants from 6 to 8 million years ago. And they are the best preserved fossil trackway of elephant footprints anywhere in the world. And had it not been for this legend, this myth, this story of dinosaur footprints and reaching us, and had we not been prepared to listen and go and have a look, perhaps we wouldn't know about it even now. So the stories are out there, and there can be a kernel of truth in them. And I think it's very important to investigate myth and legend and folk memories. They won't all be 100% true, but there may be 1, 2, 5, 10% of truth somewhere in there that is worth investigating. And then if archaeological research or research in historical archives can get some facts to go along with it, then we learn more. And we also give credit to those that have passed the stories down over the generations. And I think that's important to do as well.
I mean, absolutely critically important, as you say, that those who are the kind of guardians and curators of memory, who haven't necessarily written the official history book, and exactly as you say, they might in fact be holding the real jewels, the kind of treasures of historical understanding. And it has been a real issue, hasn't it, that history has become a written discipline rather than an oral discipline. Whereas in the past, again, when you're looking at the kind of beginning of civilizations as we know it, so we're talking kind of 3,500, 4,000, sometimes even almost 5,000 years ago, communication was obviously oral, and those the ideas of a civilization were held orally and were transmitted orally, and that is an extraordinary wealth. And as you say, we need to be looking very, very carefully at ourselves and working out who has actually appropriated whose history and therefore possibly perverted it. I mean, that's there might be a whole new understanding of history that follows post the changes in 2020. What a brilliant story about the elephant footprints. I mean, that is just so genius. And it actually, really makes me think of ancient Greek pots. Really interesting. If you look at some of those, the very famous kind of black and red figure vases, there are a few examples which are incredible, which have painted in white on them what is clearly a dinosaur skull or a dinosaur bone. But that dinosaur skull or dinosaur bone has been turned into a monster, has been turned into a mythical monster. So what we think is happening, particularly in the Peloponnese in mainland Greece, is that people are coming across actual dinosaur remains, and for them, they can see they're real, so they then invent stories of monsters that then become part of their narrative. So they're sort of early fossil hunters who make sense of what they find, and you know, very similar to your story, which must have been so. I mean, what a brilliant thing to discover.
Well, if you see, I mean, I remember some of the fossils that I found in Abu Dhabi's western region. You know, a great big jaws of a fossil elephant. There were a lot of elephants. And it's huge. And if you were someone who didn't know about fossils and paleontology, and you were wandering around that desert, and you were not literate, you know, tribes from 200 or 300 years ago, or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and you see something that is obviously of a huge animal, but an animal of which you cannot imagine what that animal was. You have no experience. Of course, you're going to invent stories about monsters. It's the only way to explain what you have physically seen yourself, but cannot understand. You have to create a myth to go around the fact.
Yes.
And then it's for other people later to find the myth and look for the fact.
Yeah, exactly.
They counteract.
Yeah, exactly. I've just been having this great adventure of following the trail of Odysseus, the legendary Greek hero, around the Aegean, from island to island. We didn't take 10 years. We took 6 months to do it, so not quite the 10 years that he took. But exactly as you're saying, another very similar example was we were looking at the myth of the Cyclops. So there's the giant, the one-eyed giant that Odysseus famously manages to trick and then eventually kill, living in a cave. And again, I'm sure you'll know about this. The remains, but actually both of tiny miniature elephants and enormous, gigantic outsize elephants have been found in the caves, and those nasal cavities that they have right in the middle of this huge skull look like nothing other than a single eye. So again, we think that almost certainly people were coming across these heads that sort of look human but with a single eye and turning those into the monsters. But alternatively, they can also give you history by accident. So my last comment on Odysseus is that he has this boar's tusk helmet that he famously wears, and it's described in minute detail in the Odyssey and the Iliad and the epic poems of Homer. And everybody thought this was kind of fantastical because it just sort of sounded too made up. But again, boar's tusks, helmets, absolutely to the last leather stitch, representing those that have been described in the poetry, have turned up in graves from the Bronze Age, from 3,200, 3,300, 3,400 years ago. So again, there is no question that somebody like Homer, this great myth maker, this epic poet, he isn't a historian, but it's almost as though he's giving us history by accident. And that's very exciting business to be in, isn't it? To be able to sort of do the detective work and jigsaw puzzle together those kernels that exactly as you're describing.
Yeah, it is interesting. It is important. And I think it also underlines the fact that there needs to be much more interdisciplinary discussion. And, you know, what an archaeologist may be looking at something, a particular site, but not look at the landscape around it. Things have moved on from 20, 30 years ago when I'm remembering. There is so much that the disciplines can learn from each other and give to each other in scientific disciplines like archaeology and geomorphology and so on. And I just wonder how much there is that we can learn from a better exchange of information between those that study folk tales and myths and those that study archaeology and history. And perhaps a little bit more respect in both directions as well. I know that some scientists rather like to depend on facts without too much speculation, and that's absolutely right and appropriate. But there is also scope for speculation that may help to lead to facts. So perhaps a little bit more respect in both directions would lead to a better understanding from which we all benefit in the future.
And have you found that specifically when looking at the story of the UAE, so sort of that there's geological evidence that turns up in stories that then, again, you're seeing in the ground in terms of hard history or hard archaeology?
Well, yes, we found it the other way round, actually. But there was, 20 odd years ago, there were some fossil specialists from the Natural History Museum in London and from Yale University that were doing some work in an area called the Subcut Mati, which is a salt flat in the far west of Abu Dhabi. And they came across a crocodile skull. And it wasn't a very old one. It wasn't a fossil one 6 million years ago. It was perhaps 10, 15,000 years old. And they happened to mention this to Sheikh Zayed, the president, and said, there must once have been a river flowing through that area. And Sheikh Zayed said, yes, yes, we have a legend that a river used to flow through that area. Well, yes, it did, but before humans would have been in the UAE. So where did that legend come from that had been passed down through the tribal families and the tribal stories and myths of origin, if you like, for 6, 8, 10,000 years? But the geological evidence is absolutely plain. Mm-hmm. So how did that become part of folk memory? Geological evidence of something that disappeared before man was around. It's curious.
Really interesting. And I think that, the answer probably lies both at the polar ends of the spectrum and centrally, that, as a mother, I know that I would sing lullabies to my daughters that my mother's grandmother had sung. So in an instance, 200 years were collapsed, and suddenly I was sharing a story just completely inadvertently that had been sung before. So there's that sort of, that storytelling, that delight in the sharing of ideas from the past. Also, as you know, very, very interesting work being done at the moment on genetic memory and whether we do actually physically carry memory within our genes as a survival mechanism, so that it might be that as a new generation we're not exposed to either a danger or delight, but we need to know about that, so that memory is physically written within our genetic material. It's very early, this kind of work, but I mean, that's really fascinating as well, isn't it? You're almost born remembering certain things.
So is that why some people will remember that they've been somewhere where their parents who are with them are absolutely certain that they have never ever been there before?
Yeah.
And yet is that the explanation, genetic memory?
Potentially.
It's how can we investigate all that?
Yes. Well,
but
yes.
do we want to investigate?
I know. Well, exactly. We get into slightly murky waters, don't we? But I mean, I think but it's ongoing. It's definitely a space for us historians to be watching. I think one of the things that we've got to share with people are polls to ask our audience, our global audience, a question. And I just wonder if we could get one of the polls up, the poll questions. That'd be great to have your involvement in this. So is it possible for our lovely host to share one of the poll questions with the audience? So this is our question number 1. I think we've got 3. Have you ever believed something to be a historical fact, but then subsequently found it to be a myth? Yes or no? Gosh, well, I'm sure there are quite a lot of yeses to that, and the other way around. But do let us know whether there's something that you were absolutely certain existed in real hard historical terms, but then found out that it was a story. Because of course stories matter to us so much. And I'm just going to give you the extraordinary. So yes, 85% of the people sharing this webinar with us today have said that they found something they believed to be facts and then turned out to be a myth, and only 15% no. So the lucky 15%, in a way, everything that you learn turns out to be true. But it is, I mean, that the fact that we turn history into myth and story, or we tell stories about the past in order to understand it, is really crucial, isn't it, Peter? We are a storytelling species. We do love to tell stories about the world around us to understand our place in it, and that has always been the case.
Well, it's been the case in the UAE much, much more recently than it has been in the UK. And that's one reason why I think the folk tales and the myths and the legends about the UAE are still so vivid. That it's only in the last sort of 60 or 70 years that the UAE became a literate society. And history and knowledge was then always, before that, was being passed down by storytellers. And, that is how the memory was passed on, that is how the knowledge was passed on, because there weren't books and papers and archives that you could go into to read. And so they would have evolved over time as little embellishments were added on or little bits were forgotten, but would have evolved in a different way from the written histories in, for example, Europe, where gradually as political circumstances changed and histories of particular events or periods get written, rewritten, some things are given greater prominence, others drop away, and then later they'll come back up again, which is what we're seeing now. But you know, the UAE, it has a very vivid oral memory, and that's why I really hope that the work that's going on to record those can be linked up to historical research as well. And do I have time to tell you another story?
Yes, yes, please do.
Which is that I was told this by again a Bedouin from the desert. He told me there was a legend that a European army had landed on the coastline several hundred years ago and marched inland to help a local tribal chieftain. And they were overwhelmed by a sandstorm and they all died in the desert. Okay, fine. There's no evidence of that in the relevant European archives from the time, which would have been Portuguese, but they haven't been studied fully enough yet anyway. So, you know, is it true? I don't know. There's no archive evidence yet. So I've been almost pleading with the relevant departments, go and talk to this guy. Talk to his fellows who may know the same story. Ask them, is there a place where you think it happened? And go out there, please, and have a look with metal detectors, with remote sensing, anywhere you like, to see, is there actually any evidence of this tale? Because there must be something behind that story. What it is, you know, we don't know yet, but there must be something.
Yes.
And like with so many other stories, there has to be a reason for their original emergence. And often that's going to be a bit of historical fact that we just don't know yet.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, even, you know, I'm going to sound, as a historian, I can't believe I'm actually just about to talk about the myth of Atlantis, but it's a very good case study that the myth of Atlantis obviously is a myth, the story of this great civilization, this sophisticated city that was swallowed up by the sea, first delivered to us by Plato, who talks about it as a kind of moral tale. So again, close on 2,500 years ago. But if you look at some of the extraordinary geoseismic events in the Aegean and the Mediterranean about 3,500 years ago, particularly the eruption of Thera, of the island of Thera, also called Santorini, actually what's described in that myth of a civilization city built with rocks of red, black and white stone, of there being circles of land, of rafts of pumice that made it impossible for ships to pass in the sea. If you then talk to volcanologists about the absolute impact of that volcano in real terms, which sent up black, red and white volcanic bombs and put pumice onto the seas that would have made it impassable, that was such a huge event that people within 100 miles distance would all have gone deaf immediately. It stopped crop growth in the Gulf. It stopped crop growth as far away as Ireland, just to the west of the UK, of England. And if you think actually an event as massive as that would not have a myth made up about it. You know, we know that it impacted.
Of course, it has to have it.
It has. So you know, really interesting. Also, I think with the stories, something that we do very early on, again, tens of thousands of years ago, right back in prehistory, is that we think really sort of the birth of the modern mind, so when we become us, is when we start to create storybook versions of ourselves in the form of sculptures and paintings. So you famously have the kind of lion-headed man from the Swabian Alps about 40,000 years ago. So there's definitely a connection between us using our imagination to explore the factual existence and actuality of our lives in a kind of storybook version. And I've got another poll question about that I'd love to share with people. So if we could have the next poll question up, please, from our lovely webinar host. It'd be interesting to see what you think of this. This is a question about whether you prefer books of historical fact or historical fiction, because of course historical fiction is hugely popular around the world. So the question, do you mainly buy books of historical fact or historical fiction? Going to be very interesting to see what the answers are coming in. You're probably all deciding, you probably buy both actually. It's probably an impossible question. So can we get the answer? So interestingly, so historical fact is a yes. I'm guessing that's the yes, 74%, and historical fiction just 26%. But we've been asked a very interesting question by somebody in the audience actually about the role of movie makers and Hollywood in delivering historical ideas. And that is a really interesting question, because people are taking real histories and turning them into films. And there's an issue with that is often driven by box office, by, you know, literally how much money you can make out of a historical story. So, I mean, that's, I don't know, Peter, what you think of movies based on real history. Do they make your skin crawl as a historian, or do you think they can be an entry point to a world that, for people who might not pick up a conventional history book?
I worry that the Hollywoodization or popularization of history through film often distorts and misleads. So that, for example, I think the role of the American forces in D-Day was presented on the screen rather differently from what actually happened on the day, when, you know, the Canadians were pretty relevant, and the British were pretty relevant, and a few others as well. And the problem with that kind of filming of history is that it not only distorts the information, it distorts the understanding of those that see it, and then that leads to other implications. So that, for example, now we see President Trump making remarks about the Second World War, which make it quite clear he just doesn't know the history, and whether he got his ideas from Hollywood is something else. It's a long time since I watched the movie Spartacus with Charlton Heston, but I suspect that the slave revolts of the time were not necessarily quite like that. The further back you go, does it matter so much? Probably not. But I tend to be a bit of a stickler for trying to be accurate. I'm quite prepared in my writing or other things to hype something up. I mean, if I find, or my team find, a particularly interesting archaeological artifact, I'm quite happy to sing about it very loudly in the media to draw attention to what we're doing, because that's how we get the money to fund the next season. But, you know, I don't like distortions of history. I can deliberate distortions. Omissions I can understand. That something wasn't considered to be important at the time. Now, if we look back, we decide it was. And I'm thinking here quickly of a gentleman called Sir George Carteret, who was a great figure in the history of the island of Jersey. And he helped King Charles II, who, in return for his support, gave him a little piece of land in the Americas that later became New Jersey. And that's fine. And there's a statue of Sir George up in the island of Jersey that has just been daubed with white paint. There are calls for it to be taken down, because besides all that, he was also involved in early trading slaves between Africa and the United States. That was not singled out as being relevant to his history in the past. But as we look at him today, yes, that is important. So history should always try to report upon facts, not deliberately distort, but at the same time, we have to recognize that our understanding of what is important in somebody's history will evolve over time.
Absolutely, absolutely. In a way, the job of the historian surely is to identify where there are gaps and lacuna, and as you say, omissions, and do everything you can in your power to fill those. Because the truth is, in the human experience, there is no such thing as a gap. There are always people living, loving, hoping, fearing in every space in the collective human experience. So, it's a brilliant thing now that people are feeling morally motivated to try to understand those histories, I think, in new ways, and to allow new voices to be the researchers and to report and identify what it's necessary to talk about. I think that's absolutely right. And which actually kind of brings me to the question. It's a kind of big question, really, but do you think that history has a moral purpose? You know, is it something which is entirely empirical and it is simply there to document facts, or do you think that we should be learning from history, that history is something that should teach us by example, as many of the great ancient historians said?
So if we don't learn from history, are we doomed to repeat it? It should be fact-based. I don't think history should be lecturing people about what they should or should not believe. Present facts and teach. I think one of the real importances of history, besides the way it helps people to understand the past, is it can teach people to inquire, to ask questions, to investigate, to get a desire to look into the reasons for things. And that may help them in all sorts of aspects of their life. Mind you, I would say that because I enjoyed doing all my history courses at university and, got a lot of pleasure out of it. So I was never a scientist. But I think if history teaches people to study, to inquire, to make their own judgments based upon the facts that are put forward to them and that they're able to identify for themselves, then I think the study of history is of enormous importance for today and tomorrow. And I think an awareness of history is also important, that you can, if you look at the past, see actions that led to mistakes, that led to disasters, or that led to successes. People's actions do have results, and you can see that in history. If you didn't repair your dam regularly, then one day there was going to be a flood that washed away your town, your village, and for a long way downstream, causing absolute havoc. And then you starve because you couldn't have the crops anymore. So maintain your dam. Look after your resources. Don't squander them. Don't live an unsustainable life. I mean, this is getting into environmental lecturing rather than history. But I think there are lectures to be given about history and lessons to be drawn from history.
Yes, I mean, that's so true, that it's both in and of itself in what history is, but as a tool to make us think and inquire. And exactly you said, question and fill the gaps is absolutely vital. And the truth is, we should never live in the past, but we really are fools if we don't accept that we live with it. So it's something that we're harming ourselves if we don't try to fully understand it. And I always think that with history, the point of history, really, it gives us, as you're saying, all the time in the world to think. So we can look back across time and space and work out why people were doing things and what those consequences were. And actually, the only thing I disagree with you, we're talking about the Hollywoodization of history. I think it really matters going right the way back to ancient history and beyond to prehistory to try to represent those people properly, because they were individuals with, you know, who live their lives, and if we can do what we can to respect them. But history gives us all the time in the world to think, and it seems to me that history reminds us to remember, to think better. So I'm slightly emotionally committed to the idea that history, in a way, as I said, is a moral agent. As you said, it's not a moralizing agent, but it asks us to think of questions of ethics and who we are and what we do. And therefore, it's so important for the next generation to love history. It seems to me all young people, all kids, are natural historians and archaeologists. If you think every child always sits down and says, tell me a story, and they want to hear a story about something that happened in the past, you put any baby from the age of about 6 months down on a pot of sand, and what they want to do is to excavate and discover. So they're all, you know, genetically archaeologists. So it would be wonderful if we can actually embrace the technological developments that there are now, so that for a future generation, history is just very naturally a part of their world. And what you were saying about oral history has a real chance to, in a way, to have a new golden age, because people communicate so much by digitally and by mobile phone, and actually the written word is becoming less and less potent in some ways, if misused, very potent. But the fact that people communicate by text message, you know, TikTok videos, all those could actually be really useful tools, I think, for a new generation to be citizen historians and archaeologists, and recording the stories of the worlds around them.
Yes, and perhaps encourage people to talk to their parents, to download their parents' memories.
Yes.
During lockdown, when I haven't been quite as busy, I sort of investigated my mother's grandfather, because I remember very vaguely that there was something to do with the sea. And I have discovered this amazing sea captain who sailed clipper ships from England to Australia as a captain for 30 years, from the 1860s to the 1890s. And there are documents about him and from him in Queensland and in Tower Hamlets in London. And I never knew it was there. My mother never ever mentioned anything about her grandfather. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think it's important to download your family's tales. And it's so much easier now to record them. You don't have to type them all up. You can actually record them on film, and somebody else can transcribe it all later on. But then the memories of past histories that would otherwise fade away will be preserved, and they'll be preserved. And perhaps, you know, there's a few generations from now, you know, someone could look at a story that was recorded this year, which sort of sets it in time, and then 2 or 3 generations from now, record the same story and see how it's evolved over the last 2 or 3 generations. And there's a lot we can do now with new technology. We shouldn't be afraid of new technology.
Yes, there's a rather brilliant thing that etymologically the words history and wisdom and technology are all the same family, and they're all to do with understanding the world clearly, of being basically wise agents for the world. So wouldn't it be brilliant if modern technology, just as the common alphabet inspired and encouraged the common reader to be a part of human society, if technology could inspire the common thinker to be what we're used to, would be a truly wonderful thing, wouldn't it? But yeah, so I think there is, you know, there is a real chance to use technology now. I'm just having a look at a couple of the questions that are coming in. Lots of people are saying, Peter, they're very curious to know exactly where the elephant footprints were found. And does this mean that a myth like Bigfoot could possibly be true? Did Bigfoot ever exist?
Bigfoot, no, we have no evidence of a Bigfoot in the UAE even 6 million years ago. The sites are the best one, because there's several trackways found now, but a place called Milesa in the western region, Al Dhafra region of Abu Dhabi, which I hope to show you one day, Bethany.
I'd love to see that.
But they are protected, and access is not open to the public without permission, because although they're exposed on the surface, it's a sort of lake bed that became, you know, lithified, turned into stone. And they're pretty fragile. but that's where they are. But if any listeners want to find out more about them, if you Google Elephant Trackway Abu Dhabi, and you'll find a lot on there about it.
Fantastic. And another question was whether myths and legends actually distort history, and actually comes back to the original title of this session, is should we be drawing a line between what is myth and what is history and what is legend? I mean, I think in our conversations at the beginning of the session, we were really saying it's very hard to draw a hard line often, because really these are kind of concepts that exist in an ecology. So sometimes they cross-fertilize, so they coexist, they exist separately, and sometimes they influence one another. But of course, it's very, very, very dangerous to base history on something which is false. I mean, I know that's an obvious statement of fact, but there is a danger, isn't there, of, as you were saying earlier, of a story actually generating a history which is based on really the kind of just the quicksand of imagination rather than fact.
I think that's right. I mean, you can't divide myth from history unless there's a lot more work done on the history to try to identify what in the myth is actually true. And there's so much in mythology that appears completely inconceivable, like Cyclops, until you actually discover the reasons why that myth might have emerged in the first place. So you can't draw a hard and fast line. But to base one's view of history on something that is purely based upon myth, and that where there have been no testing of individual points to try to prove things, that is very dangerous indeed.
Yeah, extremely dangerous. We've got a poll question about that now. So if we could, if the webinar host could give us the final poll question for our lovely global audience, that'd be wonderful. So exactly as we're discussing, this is what Napoleon Bonaparte said: "What is history but a fable agreed upon? Do the majority of historical facts give us the true picture?" There's a kind of famous thing said about historians, that all historians are frustrated novelists, that we basically want to kind of find the facts of history and then create a narrative around it. But actually lots of novelists will say that they are all frustrated historians, that they really just want to be going into the archive. So tell us what you think. So the question is, what is history but a fable agreed upon? Napoleon Bonaparte. Do the majority of historical facts give us the true picture? And I suppose the question is really whether we need to use our imagination to fill in the gaps. So if you okay, so 31 people, so it's 47% said yes, and the majority, 53%, said no. So I think we're feeling good about the solidity of history as a result of our conversation. And Peter, we've only got 5 or so minutes left, but just to finish up, we are obviously living through extraordinary times, unprecedented in many ways, precedented in many ways actually in the terms of history. I mean, we all know there have been pandemics and plagues that have caused massive history-making, epoch-shaping shifts in human society. Do you think the experiences that we've been living through, which have often felt more dystopian than utopian in 2020, what do you think the moral of our lived historical experience in 2020 will be, both for future historians and for future storytellers and legends? Because in a way, a lot of what we're living through feels like a myth, doesn't it? You know, the stories of the virus potentially originating in a single cave and then brought through and this extraordinary global impact. How do you think historians will, both historians and storytellers, will respond and react to what we are living through now?
Well, I think it may be easier for the storytellers that something comes out of nowhere and washes across the whole world, and drama and disaster. And I noticed there was a comet passing through the skies the other night, and I'm sure that can be built into it somehow. And there must be an asteroid whizzing around somewhere that's getting a bit close to Earth. So I think this enormous change that we're living through at the moment, or the disruption of what we are used to, what I've become to call the before times, because I don't think we're going back to them. I think for the storytellers, that's fine. And they will have enormous fun in coming up with things. And I think the first novels will probably hit the streets by the end of the year, but certainly next year. For the historians, I think one really big challenge for historians will be to explain how the differences in response in different countries have been so, hugely different in terms of consistency, in terms of coherence, in terms of common sense, if you like, that you can, how it is possible to have a president in Brazil who says this is all a fraud, and then he gets it, and then he's tested again, and still he says, how are historians going to explain how some people, and that's not just scientists, but ordinary people, have responded in a logical, coherent way, and political leaders and media as well, and how others have been carried away by a variety of mixture of ignorance and conspiracy theories, which of course the storytellers will have great fun with that as well. How in a world where education was supposed to be fairly widely spread, so much of the world's population in supposedly educated countries have fallen prey to myth and invention and unscientific assessment. And so I think historians will find it rather difficult to explain some of that.
Yes, that's right. And, if anything, we should learn anything, it's the terrible power of stories to affect people's lives. And you wonder if actually, in a sense, we're talking about the kind of morality of history. It's a universal morality, that we should be sharing ideas and facts and information always with good intent. If we might get things wrong, there might be kind of problematic issues, we might miss things, but if we do it with good intent, then hopefully we won't have the malign impacts of myth making. There are two more questions, Peter. I'm just going to quickly whiz through. I'll answer one of them, but I'll just tell you a second, which is definitely specifically for you. So Hazel says, in reference to the crocodile and the ancient river 10,000 years ago, could it be possible that the archaeology of modern humans who were in the area at the time is now under the Gulf? So I'll just let you think about your answer to that, and I'll answer a couple more that come up. People have been asking about the writing of history by the victors. This is a perennial issue. And absolutely, as you said, that those who hold the sword often hold the pen. And that is the job of historians, is to try to give voices to the voiceless. So you're right, history is almost exclusively written by the victor. There are moments where that's not the case. There's a very poignant moment in the fourth crusade of 1204 in the city that is now Istanbul, was then Constantinople, when it was attacked by Western invaders. A lot of the Western invaders were illiterate, but those within the city were hyper literate, and so we get their terrible accounts of the siege and then the attack of the city in 1204, and it's almost unbearable reading, and it's so rare to have that. Another question which I'm delighted to answer is, what about women in history, and do they have a voice? Your question is a brilliant one. Women have been systematically written out of history. We are, like it or not, 50% of the population, but we've only occupied about 0.5% of recorded history. So there are many around the world now who are trying to redress that balance, because what could be more delightful than understanding the world with its full and true voice, spoken and experienced by both male and female. So women are there if you know where to look. And actually, Peter, I think you'd agree, quite often archaeology gives us female history where they might not be there in the written texts, but they are there in the poetry, they are there in the oral histories, they are often there physically in the hard evidence left in the ground of archaeology.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, some of the couple of lovely images of excavations in the UAE, both from the Bronze Age, sort of 4,000 years ago. One is of a little girl who was buried in a tomb with her little puppy buried next to her.
Oh.
One of the earliest evidences of domestic pets in the UAE at the time. And another image from Tel Brak in an emirate called Kuwait, where a woman was dressed with her hair put up, with an ivory cone in her hair put up behind her head, completely bedecked with jewelry. She'd been buried in the greatest of her finery. There's a lovely there's a lovely image, mental image of that woman being given the best possible send-off. But let me answer Hazel's question. Yes, from the Gulf reached its current levels more or less about sort of 6,000 years ago. As it infilled after the end of the last ice age, yes, the people living in the lower waters of what are now the Arabian Gulf, they would either have drowned or they would have moved up to higher land. So there's a lot of archaeology under the Gulf. But if you want to read the myth about that, go and read the myth about Noah's Ark. Because if you track that back, the same versions of the same story, let me not call it a myth now, the same story are there in Babylonian stories about the infilling of the Gulf 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. So yes, plenty of archaeology on the Gulf, but we've got plenty onshore to keep us busy for a long time to come.
Fantastic. But that brings us to the end of our time. I'll just say one other thing about women in history, because it's my kind of particular delight. Kind of fear not, those women are there and their stories are waiting to be told. So if there are any budding archaeologists or historians out there, these are rich seams to tap. So become a historian. It's the most delightful thing to be, because it helps you understand and connect to people across time and space. And as we were saying, you learn so much from history. We're talking about myth and history. The one thing I see when you look at the story of the world is that powerful civilizations build great monuments, but great civilizations leave behind powerful ideas, whether those be ideas of history or actually ideas of the imagination. So let's try to make it our business in this strange 2020 year to be historians and writers and thinkers who choose to try to open minds and allow voices to speak. So I think we're out of time, and Isabel is going to come and say farewell to us. There are a couple of questions we didn't get to. I'm so sorry, everybody. But we're getting thank you and questions about neuroscience. So maybe we'll come back and do the neuroscience and the genetic versions of history as well. Isabel's with us now, I think.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? That was absolutely fascinating, and I really have been totally inspired by both of what you said about history and how important it is to us to all become budding archaeologists, become budding historians in this day where we should be speaking to elders, gathering those stories, whether they're myth stories or great grandfathers, wherever we can find that information, we should be doing it. So I think Bethany and Peter, you have whetted our appetites immensely. I loved your answer to the question about women in history, because you have made it your mission, Bethany, I think, to tell many ancient women's stories through your amazing documentaries and through your books. And I know that the UAE, Peter, has always been very much a matriarchal society. Women are incredibly important and are revered. And so I think there will be a lot of stories that can be told as well from a woman's point of view within the UAE. So a huge thank you to our wonderful speakers. A thank you to the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy, who have made this whole series possible. And to let our audience know from around the world, you've been an amazing audience over the weeks of the things. And I would like to say, can you join us for our next and last in this series, The Power of Books? How does reading great literature shape us? So do join us next Saturday, same time wherever you are, and take care and keep reading and keep discovering history. Thank you so much, everyone.